Hey there, so today I wanted to talk about objects and object creation in JavaScript. This is a common interview question that sometimes will get asked. How do you create objects in JavaScript and what are the different ways you can do them? So I thought it'd be nice to have a little video on that. So here we'll go ahead and talk about the basic way you would do that. And just for clarification, an object basically just means like a collection of some data rather than just store everything in a basic variable, right? Or have like multiple variables like first name, last name, age, and so on. You can store it all in like one central place and just refer to that as one variable name. So objects are pretty useful. It's a classification of data. So for example, if I had a person, right, I could say, all right, here's a simple way to create an object, right? So I just use what's called object literal notation. And so if I want to console log this person, I can do that. And I'm using just a basic console here. I'm using Node.js. So if you want to do this along with me, all you have to do is just make sure to install Node.js. But I'm just basically saying node objects.js. And you can see I get back this little object representation, right? It's called an object literal. I can add to this person, right? So if I want to, there's a couple ways I can do this. I can say person.firstname equals Vijay, and then person.lastname equals Menon, right? And then I can console log the person again. So there we go. And if I run node objects.js again, you can see that I get, the first time there's that nothing in the object, right? But the second time I have properties like first name and last name. Now you'll notice that these properties have to be colon separated. So this is called a key, and then this is called a value. If you're familiar with other programming languages, then you'll know, okay, yeah, there are things like keys and values in dictionaries, you know, maybe if you use Python or if you use hash tables or things like that in Java, then like it's basically the same idea, right? So last name, colon, then value. Now, one thing about objects is that you can declare them like this, or you usually can declare them like this. So I can do person2, and I can just say first name, and then I can say Sam, I can say last name, and I can say white, then age, 34, I'm going to guess here. Sorry, Sam. And console log person2. All right, so if we go back over here, you can see that here's Sam, last name, and then age, right? And you'll notice that the type of this variable here is a number, right? So an object in JavaScript can hold multiple different types. We can also add a function here, get age. So I'm going to do that by just writing function syntax, and I'm going to return this dot age. And so if I do console log person2.age, and then I say save, I can come over here and I'll see that I get back the value 34. So again, object is a way to represent all of this data in just one particular variable, person2. We use objects a lot, especially for web development, to save a whole bunch of data, you know, for different types of things like records, usernames, user profiles, you know, like movie recordings. If you work a lot with the MongoDB library, you'll see a lot of data in the form of JSON, right? And so JSON is pretty much JavaScript object notation, right? And then you can basically convert this into a string format, right, with a JSON stringify method, and then save that as a string over to like a database, you know, in your backend. So we'll go into that in a different video, essentially. But this is kind of like the basics, right? Like you create objects with object literal notation, and then as your data kind of grows in size, rather than just make a whole bunch of variables, you can keep it within the scope of like one variable and refer to it often, right? Now, as you get really into data, you'll want to start organizing this data into like classes, right? And so if you've done any sort of OOP, object-oriented programming, you'll know about things like creating blueprints and then creating, you know, objects based on those blueprints. And then there's also things called inheritance, you know, so where you create like an abstract version of maybe some blueprint, and then everything inherits from that abstract version of the blueprint. And then, you know, you can modify for special classes. So for example, we can have things like shapes. And in fact, I'm actually going to point to object.create. This is a good segue for our next way of creating a object in JavaScript. So I'm going to point to object.create in MDN, and we'll just kind of go over this particular lesson here. So you can see here they've created a person, is human. There's a false Boolean, right? So this person is not human. They have a method on here called print introduction. Hello, my name is this name. Am I human? Right? And then they use object.create person. And so person, by default, we can consider this an abstract object. And so a person is not human by itself, right? We need to add names and then give them the value to be a person, right? So me, right? If my name is Matthew, right, then I am human. So when I print my introduction, I should be able to see, am I human, right? I am human, true, correct. By itself, this abstract class is not human, but like the people that we assign to this, based off this blueprint here for a person, essentially become the real humans, right? Or the real objects. And it's kind of like the cool little, segue into using the object create method, right? So one thing about object create that varies from the object literal syntax, and I'll pull this to the side here, is that object create is used essentially to use an existing object that exists somewhere else as a prototype or a basic blueprint for a newly created object. Now in JavaScript, we don't use prototypes that much anymore because a lot of it is shielded from you with ES6 and classes, right? So in most cases, you're probably going to create a object more like this or a blueprint. So we'd say, something like along the lines of like class rectangle, right? And then extends a shape, and I'll go ahead and define that. So we'll have a class shape. By itself, shape is pretty abstract. So you can say this.x. In fact, we'll just say the shape has two sides, so it has a length and a width, and we'll say this dot width, this dot height, right? But by itself, the shape is a shape, right? It doesn't really have any meaning. Rectangles should have some kind of basic like definition attached to them. So we'll say a rectangle extends a shape, and then we'll use it down here. So const myrect, right, equals new rectangle. And then we'll also go ahead and say myrect.height, and you can see it sort of fills it for me here, it tries to, is equal to 20. And then myrect.width is equal to 10, right? So we'll console log the myrect.height, and we'll also console log the myrect.width. And so we'll save this here and we'll run this on the background, and you'll see that I have 20 and 10. And so what we'll do here is we'll just put like a little bit of a string to help us. And so we'll say that this is rectangle info, right? So we'll save this here. We'll run this once more. Now you'll notice that like I had to do all this work just to see the rectangle height and width. Wouldn't it be great if we just had some kind of method that was built in for us right here? Let's say get height and get width. And so we'll just return this dot height and then return this dot width. And then we'll also just do one more convenience function for print, and we'll say that return this dot height plus this dot width. And we're just essentially saying here we want to see the height and the width. And we'll also just make it a little cleaner. So I'll use some more ES syntax actually to clean this up. I'll say height, and then we'll put in these placeholder tags. And then we'll say width, and we'll just do, again, another template tag here. And essentially, we'll go ahead and return this. And so down here, I can just kind of use this method, right? I can just say console log, and I can say myrect, right, dot print. So we'll save that, run it again, and you'll notice that, oh, I got undefined, undefined. Oh, so I took out the values here from the rectangle, so that's okay. So what we'll do is, actually I just noticed as I was saying that I should probably move this out, and I should probably put this instead inside of a rectangle, because it makes more sense that a rectangle would have height and width, whereas a shape can pretty much have anything, right? So we're going to take all this out of the constructor here, and we're going to put that inside a constructor for the rectangle. And so we'll go ahead and give the user the ability to set a width and a height, and then we'll go ahead and put that here. This dot width equals width, and then this dot height equals height. And so now I can just basically pass in the parameters here like this. And if I save this, if I clean up the console, and oh, I just remembered one more thing. I need to call the super function here if I'm going to work with classes. That way, like, this will call the constructor method from the shape. And we'll go ahead and check this for a second here. I'll save this and run node objects.js, and you can see here I've got height 20 and width 10. So this is how you would use objects using class syntax. So far we've seen 3 ways to do it. Again, review literal, and then we saw basically object.create over here, and then we saw ES6 syntax, where we created a shape using class syntax, but you can't really create a shape because it doesn't make sense. It's an abstract class. So it makes more sense to just define common methods up in an abstract class and then eventually use them down in a real implementation of that class, like a rectangle. And so we made some more edits here so that we could pass in values right from the start. And so this function is easier to use, right? And so this kind of nice abstraction is called, encapsulation. And it's also really nice because, like, somebody doesn't really need to know how to work with the rectangle other than just provide the parameters. They can just expect that this thing is going to work just as you tell them per the API that it has a print method. They don't need to worry about the internal details. So that's kind of a nice thing, right? And so this is a very common pattern anyway in other programming languages. In JavaScript, you get to kind of be a little bit more loose about these terms. It's not as strict, but it's a good way to kind of like get up to speed. There are a few other ways to create objects. So you can basically, we reviewed literal syntax, the object create, we used class syntax. There's also the functions constructor syntax, which is a little bit older. And for time, actually, I'm going to save us some typing here, and I'll just kind of demo that here. Essentially, let's see here. So I was working off of the example from MDN, and if I was going down here, let's see, I think if I scroll down a little bit, you can see this example, classical inheritance with object.create, right? And so what we've got here is a function constructor. And a function constructor basically allows you to create a new object. You just copy this right here, right, if you want to see. And we'll just, we'll go along with the example for now. Let's just not assume anything like, that this is an abstract class or anything. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say const, and I'll call this shape 2 just to be a little bit more careful with words here. So shape 2 is equal to a new shape, right? By the way, sorry. So let's go ahead and run this again. So I'm going to do node objects.to. So you can see here that you get back x0 and y0, right? So you get some initialized data. This is kind of like the other way that people who have done JavaScript for a long time can probably remember using function constructors and then essentially creating like their own objects via this syntax, right? The new keyword followed by the constructor name. We usually uppercase the name just so that way we know that this is different from a regular JavaScript function. If you did something like this, it would be a little bit harder. And also naming is really important when you're doing functional constructors. Essentially, like you can make a mistake like I did, right? If you're not careful, where you don't really understand what the name is. So I think classes are a little bit better as terms of a syntax. If we go over to this example here, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just kind of go through the whole thing here. I'm going to copy this and we'll kind of go through it, right? So now that we kind of understand how, basically shapes work and rectangles work, and then how to like do constructors, with the constructor function syntax. Let's go on to basically kind of like the culmination of this entire video, basically like how you can use object.create. And by the way, what I'm giving you here is probably more than you need for an interview question, but it's good to know, right? It's good to just know these things. That way, like you can kind of speak to the difference between why to use object.create or use an object literal, or why to use maybe a functional constructor or maybe a class syntax, right? You can kind of go through all that now. And so essentially here, right? If we were to not have the class syntax, right, then what we would end up with is probably something more like this, right? We would need to write out, our abstract class, which they call the superclass, right? And then the superclass has methods like we saw earlier with the class where we did print, right? All shapes should be able to move. And so here's a method that we can use for any implementation of this class. So we'll have rectangle down here, and rectangle is a shape. And so we're going to call, right, much like we did with that super method that we saw in the class syntax, we're going to call the method for shape, so that way we get all the inheritance from the shape. And then essentially we go ahead and then set the shape prototype object, right, which is this, to be the blueprint that we use for any future rectangle prototypes, right, any rectangle blueprints. So this essentially says that we're going to create an object with the shape prototype as its backing. And so anytime you create a rectangle, it's automatically going to get an X and a Y value as a shape. And then it's also going to get this move function. And then finally, we're going to set the prototype constructor to be rectangle, right? And if this is a little confusing, this is basically just saying that essentially if we wanted to find out later on who made this rectangle, right? We could kind of use the instance of operator in JavaScript that's available to us to let us know, hey, is this rectangle a type of rectangle, right? Like, is this coming from the rectangle blueprint? And so on too. If we wanted to check if this is coming from shape or if this is inherited from shape, we can take a look and see, is this rect variable, right? And that's kind of like my point essentially, is that the variables that we create with these blueprints, are they instances of, rectangles and shapes? It's like easy to find out if you use this operator when you do things like add the constructor to rectangle, right? So point the constructor to the rectangle class. Otherwise, if you don't, then by default, like they say here in MDN, it will be the shape. So just food for thought, right? Defining a class in JavaScript, sort of the old classical way, was doing something similar to this, right? Where you have to like work with prototypes, and you have to work with setting up your abstract classes called superclasses, and then subclassing from a superclass, which is now just done for you with nice sugar like the extends keyword. And basically, yeah, now like it's a little bit simpler to create like simple objects. But so to wrap up the point here, if we just run node index.js or objects.js, yeah, that's correct. Then basically we can see nothing because I haven't saved this file. So let's do this one more time, node objects.js, and we can see, all right, here, is rectangle an instance of rectangle? True. Is rectangle an instance of shape? True. And then shape moved, right? Here's that method that comes from the abstract superclass. And so essentially, if I wanted to also just take a look and see what the object itself looks like, I can do that over here. And so you can see that's what my object looks like. It has a shape of X and Y, X1 and Y1. And you'll notice that this differs from the abstract class, which doesn't have any values, right? And that should make sense. So now you've seen four basic ways to create an object in JavaScript. And this should probably be like a pretty good review session as well for you if you were not that familiar with these different types of methods, including object create. I would say go check out MDN for more information on this method. And then, as you feel comfortable with this, you should be in a good spot to pretty much explain how to create an object using different types of ways in JavaScript. So hope this video has been helpful for you, and I'll see you around.